July 1944. American tanks are getting slaughtered in Normandy. Not by German guns. Not by mines. By bushes. Literal bushes. Every time a Sherman tries to push through a hedgerow, it tips up like a dying whale, exposing its thin belly armor to German Panzerfausts. In 3 weeks, the Allies lost 700 tanks. Then one sergeant grabs scrap metal from a beach, welds it to a tank, and changes the entire war. The Germans called it the fork from hell. We called it the rhino. Purple. Here's how junkyard engineering saved the invasion. But before we dive into how one man's crazy idea saved thousands of lives, we need to understand something crucial. We need to understand why Normandy was chosen in the first place. We need to understand the absolute madness of planning the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Because without that context, you won't truly appreciate how close the Allies came to losing everything and how a simple piece of welded scrap metal changed the course of World War II forever. Let's go back. Way back. To a time when Adolf Hitler thought he was invincible. By 1942, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. France had fallen in just 6 weeks back in 1940. The British had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk. The Soviet Union was losing millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front. And America had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Hitler's empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the gates of Moscow. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the scorching sands of North Africa. It was the largest military conquest Europe had seen since Napoleon. Maybe since the Roman Empire, and Hitler knew that eventually, the Allies would try to take it all back. He knew they would have to invade Western Europe. There was no other way to defeat Germany. Bombing raids could destroy factories and cities, but they couldn't capture territory. Only boots on the ground could do that. Only tanks rolling through fields. Only soldiers fighting street by street, village by. He knew they would have to invade Western Europe. There was no other way to defeat Germany. Bombing raids could destroy factories and cities, but they couldn't capture territory. Only boots on the ground could do that. Only tanks rolling through fields. Only soldiers fighting street by street, village by village. So Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall. This was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress stretching over 2,400 miles along the coastline of Western Europe. From Norway in the north to Spain in the south. Bunkers. Gun emplacements. Mines. Beach obstacles. Tank traps. Everything the German military could think of to stop an amphibious invasion. In Hitler's mind, the Atlantic Wall would be his insurance policy. The Allies could throw everything they had at it, and it would hold. Germany could then focus on crushing the Soviet Union in the east, and by the time that was done, the war would be over. Simple, right? Except it wasn't simple. Because Hitler made a critical mistake. He assumed the Allies would attack at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, just 21 miles from Dover, England. It made perfect sense. Shortest distance. Fastest crossing. Easiest logistics. The Germans poured most of their resources into fortifying Pas-de-Calais. The best troops. The heaviest guns. The thickest concrete. But the Allies weren't going to Pas-de-Calais. They were going somewhere else entirely. The decision to invade Normandy was made after months of debate among Allied commanders. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, knew that the element of surprise was everything. If the Germans knew exactly where and when the invasion would happen, they could concentrate their forces and push the Allies back into the sea. The invasion would fail. They could concentrate their forces and push the Allies back into the sea. The invasion would fail. The war would drag on for years. Millions more would die. Normandy was chosen for several reasons. First, it was within range of Allied fighter planes based in England. Air cover was essential for protecting the invasion fleet and the troops on the beaches. Second, the beaches at Normandy were suitable for landing large numbers of troops and vehicles. They weren't too steep, not too rocky, and had relatively firm sand. Third, and most importantly, the Germans weren't expecting an attack there, but Normandy had a problem. A big problem. A problem that would come back to haunt the Allies in ways they never anticipated. The problem was the blockage. Now, if you've never heard of the blockage, you're not alone. Most people haven't. Blue, it's not exactly a topic that comes up at dinner parties. Hey, did you know about the ancient Norman hedgerow system and its tactical implications for armored warfare? Yeah, that's not a conversation starter. But for the soldiers who had to fight through it, the blockage became a living nightmare. A green hell that swallowed tanks whole and turned every field into a potential death trap. So what exactly is the blockage? Let me explain, because this is crucial to understanding everything that comes next. The blockage is a type of landscape found in parts of France, particularly in Normandy and Brittany. It consists of small agricultural fields surrounded by thick hedgerows. But when I say hedgerows, I don't mean the neat little bushes you might see in an English garden or a suburban neighborhood. These aren't ornamental plants trimmed by a guy with hedge clippers. These are ancient walls of vegetation that have been growing for centuries. Some for over 1,000 years. We're talking about earthen banks, sometimes 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense tangles of bushes, brambles, and trees. The roots of these plants have grown deep into the soil, intertwining with each other to create a barrier that's almost as solid as concrete. Imagine taking a regular dirt mound, planting a forest on top of it, and then letting it grow undisturbed for 800 years. That's a Norman hedgerow. That's what American tanks were trying to drive through, and it gets worse. These hedgerows weren't just scattered randomly across the landscape. They enclosed every single field. Every pasture. Every orchard. Every tiny patch of farmland had its own hedgerow wall surrounding it. And the fields in Normandy are small, much smaller than American farms. Some are barely an acre in size. Do you know how many hedgerow enclosed fields there are in Normandy? Over 500,000. 500,000 individual fields, each one surrounded by walls of earth and vegetation. Each one is a potential ambush site. Each one is a potential grave for American soldiers. The Allied planners knew about the blockage. They had aerial photographs. They had maps. They had intelligence reports. But somehow, they completely underestimated how difficult it would be to fight through. Maybe they thought tanks could just push through the hedgerows as they pushed through fences. Maybe they assumed explosives could clear paths quickly. Maybe they just didn't think it would be that big of a deal. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why the blockage was such a disaster, we need to understand D-Day itself. We need to understand the scale of what the Allies were attempting. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The day that would determine the fate of the world. The night before the invasion, over 23,000 airborne troops parachuted or glided into Normandy behind German lines. Their mission was to secure key bridges, destroy enemy communications, and create chaos before the main assault. Many of them landed miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Some were killed before they hit the ground. But enough of them survived to accomplish their objectives. As dawn broke on June 6, the largest armada in human history approached the Normandy coast. Over 5,000 ships. 11,000 aircraft. 156,000 soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other allied nations. This wasn't just an invasion. This was the combined might of the free world, aimed directly at the heart of Nazi tyranny. The beaches were given code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach was assigned to a different Allied force. The Americans took Utah and Omaha. The British took Gold and Sword. The Canadians took Juno. At Utah Beach, the invasion went relatively smoothly. The preliminary bombardment had been effective. German defenses were lighter than expected. American troops pushed inland with fewer casualties than anticipated. By the end of the day, over 21,000 soldiers had landed at Utah, with fewer than 200 killed. Omaha Beach was a different story entirely. It was a slaughterhouse. The German defenses at Omaha were far stronger than intelligence had suggested. The preliminary naval bombardment had missed most of the enemy positions. Many of the amphibious tanks specially designed DD, duplex drive, tanks that could float to shore sank in the rough seas before they even reached the beach. The infantry had to advance across open sand, exposed to withering machine gun fire from fortified positions on the bluffs above. In the first hour alone, American casualties at Omaha Beach were catastrophic. Entire companies were wiped out before they could reach the seawall. Bodies floated in the surf. Blood turned the foam pink. The beach was littered with burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the dead and dying. There's a famous scene in the movie Saving Private Ryan that depicts the landing at Omaha Beach. If you've seen it, you know how brutal it was. And here's the thing: veterans who were actually there said the movie toned it down. The reality was even worse. At one point, General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces, seriously considered evacuating Omaha Beach and redirecting troops to other sectors. The situation was that dire. The invasion was on the verge of failure at its most critical point, but the American soldiers didn't give up. Small groups of men, led by brave officers and sergeants, began to fight their way up the bluffs. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes in the barbed wire. They climbed steep cliffs under fire. They knocked out German bunkers one by one. By sheer determination and sacrifice, they clawed their way off the beach and established a foothold. By the end of D-Day, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. Over 156,000 troops had landed in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress Europe was no longer impenetrable. So the Allies won, right? D-Day was a success. Time to march to Berlin. War over, not even close. D-Day was just the beginning. The hardest fighting was still to come. And the blockage was about to teach the Allies a lesson they would never forget. In the days immediately following D-Day, the Allied plan was simple: break out of the beachhead, push inland, and start the race across France. The British and Canadians would advance toward Caen, a major city that was supposed to fall on D-Day itself. The Americans would push south and west, capturing the port of Cherbourg to secure supply lines, and then swing around for a massive breakout into open country. On paper, it looked straightforward. The Germans were caught off guard. Their reserves were scattered. Many of their best units were still positioned at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The Allies had air superiority. They had more tanks. They had more men. Victory seemed inevitable, but then the Allies entered the blockage. And everything fell apart. The first sign of trouble came almost immediately. American infantry units advanced from the beaches into the hedgerow country, expecting to move quickly. Instead, they found themselves in a maze. The narrow lanes between hedgerows were perfect ambush sites. German soldiers could hide just yards away, completely invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Imagine walking down a hallway where every door could have a German machine gun behind it. Now imagine that hallway is 5 miles long and made of thorns. And the doors are invisible. That's what fighting in the blockage was like. The Germans had turned every hedgerow into a defensive position. They dug foxholes at the base of the earthen banks. They positioned machine guns to cover the gaps between fields. They pre-registered their mortars and artillery to drop shells on any Americans who tried to cross open ground. And the hedgerows provided perfect cover. You could be standing 10 feet from a German soldier and not see him. The vegetation was so thick, so dense, that visibility was often measured in yards rather than miles. American soldiers couldn't use their superior numbers or firepower because they couldn't see what they were shooting at. But here's where it gets really ugly. Here's where the tanks come in. The American military doctrine in World War II emphasized combined arms warfare. Infantry and tanks were supposed to work together. The tanks provided firepower and protection. The infantry provided eyes and ears, spotting enemy positions and protecting the tanks from close-range anti-tank weapons. Together, they were supposed to be unstoppable. In the blockage, this doctrine completely broke down. When a Sherman tank approached a hedgerow, it had 2 options. Option 1, try to drive around the hedgerow, using the gaps between. This sounds reasonable, right? Just go through the gate or the lane and avoid the hedgerow entirely. The Germans anticipated this. They mined every single gap, every gate, every lane. Every possible route around the hedgerows was booby-trapped. Tanks that tried to go around triggered mines that blew off their tracks, immobilizing them. And an immobilized tank in the blockage was a dead tank. German infantry would swarm it with Panzerfausts and grenades. Option 2, drive straight through the hedgerow, just power through it with brute force. After all, a Sherman tank weighs 33 tons. It's got 400 horsepower. It should be able to push through some bushes. Right, wrong. Dead wrong. Here's what actually happened when a Sherman tried to drive through a Norman hedgerow. And pay attention, because this is the key to understanding why the Rhino was so revolutionary. When the front of the tank hit the hedgerow's earthen bank, the tracks started climbing. The Sherman was designed for open terrain, flat ground, rolling hills, and maybe some light obstacles. It wasn't designed to climb vertical walls. As the tank climbed the hedgerow, its nose pointed upward at a steep angle. 30 degrees. 40 degrees. Sometimes even steeper, and as the nose went up, the belly went down. Sherman's belly armor was exposed. Not for long, maybe 3 to 5 seconds, but that was more than enough. Now, to understand why this was so catastrophic, you need to understand something about tank armor. Tank designers in World War II knew that the most likely threat to a tank was enemy fire from the front. Enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery would all be shooting from roughly the same level as the tank, or from slightly elevated positions. So they put the thickest armor at the front. The Sherman's frontal armor was about 2 to 4 inches thick, depending on the variant. Not great by late war standards, but decent enough to stop most infantry weapons and some anti-tank rounds. The belly armor was a different story. The belly was only about half an inch thick. Maybe 3/4 of an inch in some places. Just enough to protect against mines and rough terrain. Nobody expected the belly to be shot at directly. Why would they? Under what circumstances would an enemy be shooting at the bottom of a tank? The circumstances were called hedgerows. And the weapon was called the Panzerfaust. Let's talk about the Panzerfaust for a minute, because this weapon was the bane of every Allied tanker's existence. The Panzerfaust was a German single-shot, disposable anti-tank weapon. Think of it as the ancestor of the modern RPG. A hollow tube with a big explosive warhead on the front. Point it at a tank. Pull the trigger. Watch the tank burn. The beauty of the Panzerfaust from the German perspective was its simplicity. It required almost no training to use. Any soldier could pick one up and become an instant tank killer. It was light enough that infantry could carry several of them. And it was cheap enough that the Germans could produce them by the hundreds of thousands. The warhead used a shaped charge, a cone of copper that, upon detonation, formed a superplastic jet of metal traveling at incredible velocities. This jet could punch through several inches of armor like a hot knife through butter. Against Sherman's frontal armor, the Panzerfaust was a threat, but not a guaranteed kill. The angle of impact mattered. The distance mattered. A skilled tanker might survive a frontal hit against the Sherman's belly armor. Half an inch of steel versus a shaped charge designed to penetrate 4 inches. There was no contest. A Panzerfaust to the belly was a death sentence. The molten jet would slice through the armor, igniting fuel, detonating ammunition, killing everyone inside. Now you understand why the hedgerow problem was so devastating. Every time a Sherman tried to push through a hedgerow, it exposed its belly for a few critical seconds. And waiting on the other side of that hedgerow was a German soldier with a Panzerfaust. The German didn't even need to aim carefully. The tank was right there, belly exposed, moving slowly. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, and it wasn't just the Panzerfaust. The Germans also used the Panzerschreck, a larger, more powerful rocket launcher based on the American bazooka. They used anti-tank guns hidden in the hedgerows. They used teller mines buried in the soil. They used everything they had to turn the bocage into a tank graveyard. The American tankers quickly learned that climbing a hedgerow was suicide. But what choice did they have? They couldn't go around, the gaps were mined. They couldn't stay put, they were needed to support the infantry. They couldn't call in air strikes, the bocage was so dense that it was impossible to identify targets from the air. They were stuck. Literally and figuratively stuck. In a landscape that seemed designed specifically to kill them, American tankers started developing a dark sense of humor about their predicament. They called the Sherman tank the Ronson, after the famous cigarette lighter brand whose slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." Because that's what Sherman did in the bocage. They lit up. First time. Every time. But the nickname wasn't just about hedgerows. It reflected a deeper problem with the Sherman tank itself, a problem that had been building since the tank was first designed. The M4 Sherman was developed in 1941 and 1942, during a period when American military planners had certain assumptions about how the war would be fought. They believed that tanks should primarily be used for infantry support and exploitation, breaking through enemy lines and racing into the rear areas. They didn't expect tanks to fight other tanks very often. That's what tank destroyers were for. Based on these assumptions, the Sherman was designed to be reliable, easy to produce, and easy to transport. It had a relatively small gun, a 75mm cannon that was adequate against German tanks in 1942 but increasingly outmatched by 1944. It had moderate armor enough to protect against most threats in 1942, but dangerously thin by 1944. It used a gasoline engine, powerful and reliable, but prone to catching fire when the tank was hit. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the Sherman was facing German tanks that completely outclassed it. The Panther tank had a 75mm high-velocity gun that could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor from over 1,000 yards. The Tiger tank had an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman from nearly a mile away. Both German tanks had thicker armor that the Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate, except at close range. To put it bluntly, in a straight-up fight, one Tiger could kill multiple Shermans before going down. And the American tankers knew it. The gasoline engines made everything worse. When a Sherman was hit by an anti-tank round or a Panzerfaust, the gasoline often ignited. The tank would become an inferno within seconds. The crew had maybe 5 seconds to escape before the flames consumed them. Many didn't make it. The interior of a burning Sherman reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were incinerated. Others survived the initial fire but suffered horrific burns that left them disfigured for life. The psychological trauma was immense, not just for the men inside the tanks, but for their comrades who watched helplessly as their friends burned alive. This was the reality of armored warfare in Normandy. Not the glorious tank charges of Hollywood movies. Not the clean, sanitized version of history. This was fire and screaming and the smell of burning flesh, and in the Bocage, all of these problems were amplified tenfold. In the first 3 weeks after D-Day, the Allies lost over 700 tanks in Normandy. Many of them were knocked out in the hedgerow fighting. The casualty rate among tank crews was horrific. Some units lost 100% of their tanks not once, but multiple times, as replacement vehicles were rushed forward only to be destroyed in the same killing fields. The 3rd Armored Division, one of the American Army's elite tank units, landed in Normandy with 232 tanks. Over the course of the campaign, they lost over 600 tanks, nearly 3 times their original strength. The average Sherman in Normandy survived for just 2.5 months before being knocked out. The average tank crewman had a life expectancy measured in weeks. These weren't statistics to the men fighting in the Bocage. These were their friends. Their brothers. Men they had trained with, lived with, fought beside. One day, they were joking around, playing cards, and writing letters home. The next day, they were a charred corpse being pulled out of a smoking tank hull. The psychological toll was immense. Many tankers developed what we would now call PTSD. They had nightmares about burning. They flinched at the smell of gasoline. Some refused to get back into tanks at all. They would rather face court-martial than climb into another steel coffin, but they didn't have a choice. The war had to be won. And to win the war, they had to break out of the Bocage. The Allied High Command was growing increasingly frustrated. The initial plan called for capturing Caen on D-Day itself. Weeks later, the city was still in German hands. The Americans were supposed to have swept through the Bocage and reached open country. Instead, they were advancing at a crawl, sometimes just a few hundred yards per day, paid for in blood. Every day that the Allies remained trapped in the beachhead was another day for the Germans to bring up reinforcements. Another day for the Atlantic Wall to be rebuilt. Another day for Hitler to develop new wonder weapons. Time was running out. The generals tried everything they could think of. They ordered massive artillery barrages to blast gaps in the hedgerows. This worked, but it took too long, 30 minutes or more per hedgerow, and there were hundreds of hedgerows per mile. At that rate, the breakout would take years. They tried using tanks with bulldozer blades to clear paths. The Dozer tanks were priority targets for German anti-tank gunners. They were also slow and loud, announcing their presence long before they arrived. Ambushes were easy to set up. They tried having engineers blow gaps with explosives. This also worked, but it was dangerous, time-consuming, and used up enormous quantities of explosives that were needed for other purposes. Nothing was working. Every solution created new problems. Every tactic the Allies developed, the Germans found a counter. Morale was plummeting. The initial euphoria of D-Day had given way to grim despair. Soldiers wrote letters home, wondering if they would ever see their families again. Officers questioned whether the invasion would succeed. Some historians believe that the Bokkaj fighting came close to breaking the American Army's spirit, and then, in the middle of all this chaos and death and desperation, a sergeant from New Jersey had an idea. His name was Curtis G. Cullen III. And he was about to change history. Curtis Cullen was born on December 7, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey. Yes, December 7, the same date that would later become infamous as the attack on Pearl Harbor. You could say he was destined to be involved in World War II from the day he was born. Cullen grew up during the Great Depression, a time when jobs were scarce, and families struggled to survive. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't privileged. He was just a regular guy from a regular town, trying to make his way in a world that wasn't particularly kind to regular guys. When the war came, Cullen enlisted. He wasn't drafted, he volunteered. Like millions of other young Americans, he believed it was his duty to fight for his country. He was assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit tasked with scouting ahead of the main army, gathering intelligence, and engaging enemy forces when necessary. By July 1944, Cullen was a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer responsible for leading a small group of soldiers. He wasn't a general. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a college degree or specialized technical training. He was just a soldier, but a soldier who had been in the Bokkaj long enough to understand the problem intimately. Cullen had watched tanks die. He had seen his fellow soldiers burned alive. He had witnessed the frustration and despair that was spreading through the ranks. And he was determined to find a solution. The story of how the Rhino was invented varies slightly depending on which account you read. But the essential elements are the same. In early July 1944, Cullen was sitting with his unit, brainstorming ideas for breaking through the hedgerows. Everyone was throwing out suggestions. Most of them were impractical or had already been tried. The mood was tense. Men were dying every day, and nobody had a solution. Then someone and historians debate exactly who suggested attaching metal teeth or prongs to the front of a tank. The idea was that instead of climbing up and over the hedgerow, the tank would dig into it and push through. Like a plow cutting through soil. Or like a rhino charging through a fence. It was a simple idea. Almost too simple. The kind of idea that makes you wonder why nobody had thought of it before. Cullen didn't dismiss it. He didn't laugh it off. He thought about it. He considered the physics. He wondered if it could actually work. And then he decided to try it. Now here's the part of the story that's almost too perfect to be true. Almost too ironic. Almost too Hollywood. The scrap metal that Cullen used to build the first prototype. It came from German beach obstacles. Remember the Atlantic Wall? Remember Hitler's grand plan to make the coastline of Western Europe impenetrable? One component of that plan was the placement of thousands of steel obstacles on the beaches. These were designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, to impale soldiers wading ashore, to create chaos and death in the surf. Many of these obstacles were simple steel structures, X-shaped frames, angled poles, and crossed beams. After the beaches were secured, the Allies cleared them away. The steel was piled up, considered scrap. Junk. Worthless debris from a battle already won. Cullen looked at that scrap metal and saw something else. He saw the raw material for a weapon that would defeat the hedgerows. He saw the irony of using German defenses against German defenses. He saw an opportunity. With the help of a few other soldiers and a welding torch, Cullen fabricated the first hedgerow cutter. It was crude. It was ugly. It was held together with welds that probably wouldn't have passed any official inspection, but it worked. The device consisted of 4 or 5 steel prongs, each one about 3 feet long, welded to a heavy steel plate that was bolted to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The prongs angled slightly downward, designed to bite into the earth rather than ride up over it. On July 14, 1944, Bastille Day, France's national holiday, the first operational test was conducted. A Sherman tank equipped with Cullen's device rumbled toward a hedgerow. Soldiers watched nervously. Officers watched skeptically. Everyone remembered all the failed attempts. Everyone expected this to fail, too. The tank hit the prongs dug in. For a moment, the tank seemed to hesitate, straining against the centuries-old barrier. And then, the hedgerow exploded outward. Dirt and roots and vegetation flew in all directions. The Sherman plowed through, emerging on the other side still level, still protected, still deadly. It worked. Holy God, it actually worked. I wish I could have seen Cullen's face at that moment. The sergeant from New Jersey, standing in a French field, watching his improvised invention do something that generals and engineers had failed to accomplish. He must have felt like a genius. Or maybe he just felt relief. Relief that finally, they had a way to fight back. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Within hours, officers were crowding around to see the demonstrations. Within a day, the news reached the highest levels of command. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, personally came to observe a demonstration. Bradley was under immense pressure to break out of the beachhead. He had been searching for a solution for weeks. When he saw the Rhino in action, he immediately recognized its potential. Bradley ordered that every available Sherman be fitted with hedgerow cutters immediately. Not some tanks. Not most tanks. Every tank. But there was a problem. A big problem. Operation Cobra, the massive offensive designed to break out of Normandy, was scheduled to begin on July 25. That gave them just 11 days to modify hundreds of tanks. 11 days to manufacture enough hedgerow cutters to equip an entire army. 11 days to train crews on how to use them effectively. What happened next was one of the most remarkable feats of improvised manufacturing in military history. Every welding torch in the American sector was put to work. Mechanic, every maintenance crew, every soldier who knew how to weld was recruited. Mobile workshops were set up near the front lines. Scrap metal was gathered from every available source: beach obstacles, destroyed vehicles, captured German equipment, anything that could be cut and welded. There were no blueprints. No standardized designs. No quality control inspectors. Men just looked at the prototype, figured out how it worked, and started building copies. Some were better than others. Some barely held together. But they kept building. Imagine a garage full of exhausted mechanics, working 20-hour shifts, welding steel prongs onto tanks while bombs fall in the distance. Imagine the pressure. Imagine the desperation. Imagine knowing that every hour of delay could cost lives. They did it. In 11 days, American workshops produced and installed hedgerow cutters on over 500 tanks. Some units achieved modification rates of 60%. Some reached nearly 100%. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, the American Army had transformed. What had been a force paralyzed by the blockage was now an armored juggernaut equipped with a weapon the Germans had never seen and couldn't counter. The Rhinos were ready. And the Germans had no idea what was coming. The morning of July 25, 1944, began with the largest tactical air bombardment of the war. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped their payloads on German positions near St. Lo. The earth shook. The sky turned black with smoke and dust. Soldiers on both sides thought the world was ending. The bombing was supposed to destroy German defenses and clear the way for the ground assault. But something went wrong. Some of the bombs fell short, landing on American positions. Over 100 American soldiers were killed by their own Air Force, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed in the European theater. It was a tragic start to what was supposed to be a triumphant day. But the operation couldn't be stopped. Too much was riding on it. The ground assault went ahead. And then the Rhinos charged. American tanks surged forward, prongs first. They hit the hedgerows that had stopped them for weeks, and instead of climbing up, instead of exposing their bellies, instead of dying in flames, they punched straight through. One hedgerow. Then another. Then another. The Shermans crashed through barriers that had stood for centuries, barriers that had killed hundreds of their comrades, barriers that had seemed utterly invincible. German soldiers who had grown confident in their defensive positions suddenly found themselves facing tanks they couldn't kill. The Panzerfausts that had been so deadly were now useless, the tanks weren't exposing their bellies anymore. The minefields on the lanes and gates were worthless, the tanks weren't using the lanes and gates anymore. The entire German defensive strategy in the blockade collapsed in a matter of hours. Captured German soldiers later described their confusion. They had no idea what they were seeing. Some thought the Americans had deployed a completely new tank. Others thought it was some kind of secret weapon. None of them understood that they were being defeated by scrap metal and a sergeant's ingenuity. In just 2 days, American forces advanced more territory than they had in the entire month since D-Day. The breakout had begun. By August 1st, the breach in the German lines was wide enough for General George S. Patton's Third Army to pour through. Patton, the aggressive tank commander who had been champing at the bit for weeks, finally had his chance. His tanks raced across France at speeds that shocked the world. In a single month, the Allies advanced from the Normandy beachhead to the outskirts of Paris. On August 25, 1944, the French capital was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, cheering and weeping and celebrating. For years of Nazi occupation had ended. And it had started with prongs. For steel prongs were welded to the front of a tank by a sergeant who was tired of watching his friends die. But what happened to Curtis Cullen? The man who had started it all? Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his invention. One of the highest honors for non-combat achievement. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, personally acknowledged that the Rhino had been critical to the success of Operation Cobra. But Cullen didn't rest on his laurels. He didn't go on a publicity tour. He didn't write a book or give interviews. He just kept fighting. He was a soldier, and there was still a war to win. In September 1944, just 2 months after his invention had saved the Normandy campaign, Cullen's unit was operating in Belgium. They ran into a German ambush. Curtis Cullen was seriously wounded. He lost both of his legs below the knee. There's something almost unbearably cruel about this. The hero of the hedgerows, cut down just weeks after his greatest triumph. The man who had saved so many lives, losing his own legs in a nameless skirmish in Belgium. Cullen was evacuated to the United States. He was fitted with prosthetic legs. He adapted to his new reality with the same determination he had shown in Normandy. He married. He had a family. He lived a quiet life far from the battlefields where he had made history. Curtis Cullen died on June 19, 1963. He was only 48 years old. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, but some historians believe his health never fully recovered from his wartime injuries. Most people have never heard of Curtis Cullen. He doesn't have a monument or a museum. His name doesn't appear in most history textbooks. But every Allied soldier who survived the blockade, every tank crew that made it home, every infantryman who didn't die in a hedgerow ambush owes him a debt.